All right, very exciting. So let's start with some audience questions. This is a super simple one. Please raise your hand if you can imagine your dinner later tonight. All right, perfect, great. Now this has two parts. So please raise your hand if you have now or had in the past a pet, like a dog, a cat, or a hamster. And now leave your hand raised if you think that your pet can imagine their dinner. Okay, some hesitation. All right, I see it's like half and half. Great, you believe in your pets. That's perfect. So as you can understand, I'm interested in imagination. I want to know what it is, where it came from, how it evolved, and also, is it unique to humans? Or maybe other animals can imagine as well. Now, when I'm speaking about imagination, I'm most interested in mental simulations. This feeling we have of a movie theater in our mind. Maybe you experience images or an inner dialogue, and either way, you can think about your dinner later tonight, even though it's not in front of you right now. So we call these simulations. Now, in order to understand human imagination and how it evolved, we need to, in a sense, retrace our steps. So we need to think what kind of imagination our very, very ancient ancestors had. Now, according to the theory of evolution, some animals living today are mentally closer to our ancient ancestors than we are. So this is why I study imagination in animals. And the idea is that they give us this hypothetical baseline from which human imagination continue to develop. So we can also ask what mental abilities we share with other animals and what is truly unique to humans. Now, when trying to study animal imagination, we hit a huge barrier, which is language. So we can't just ask animals, what are you imagining right now? Or tell our dog, please imagine your dinner. So in order to overcome this barrier, I'm taking two paths to studying animal imagination. The first one is behavior. So I'm trying to think what kind of behaviors hint at imagination or require the animal to use imagination. And I'm going to give you an example. This is a kind of riddle that chimpanzees need to solve. And I'll start from the fourth panel where you see the riddle. So the chimpanzee comes into the room. He sees two bunches of grapes, but he can't reach them because they are behind glass. Now, the grapes are held up by a dried stick of pasta. And there's a small hole in the glass. So if the chimpanzee pokes the hole, he can break the pasta, the grapes will fall down, and then he can reach them. All right? Now, the chimpanzee, he comes into the room, and he is given a selection of tools. So he needs to choose the correct tool, and also carry it around, like outside the room and back in at a later point. So the chimpanzee needs to show that he understands which tool will actually break the pasta, and also that he can plan his actions because he will be able to get the grapes only at a later point. So we can think that a chimpanzee has this mental simulation. He's seeing himself choosing the tool and poking at the pasta and getting the grapes. And we can also say that planning is the best indication we have of imagination. So even for ourselves, like right now it's quite hot in Tel Aviv. But if I'm planning a trip to London, I can imagine how rainy London will be, and I will plan ahead. I will pack a raincoat. So obviously right now I don't need a raincoat. Okay, so this is the part of behaviors that can indicate imagination. Now, to supplement this, I also study the brain. So at least in humans, we can invite you into the lab and put you in an MRI machine and ask you to imagine things. And we see what's going on in your brain when you are imagining. So researchers have identified structures in our brains that are critical for imagination. And what I do in my research is I compare the human brain to other animals. So I ask, do we see the structures that are critical for human imagination in other animals? And do they function similarly? And finally, how far back in evolution do these similarities go? All right, so up until now, you might be imagining me in a white lab coat, feeding grapes to chimpanzees and scanning their brains. But this is actually not what I do. I'm a philosopher. So I'm quite lucky to be able to step back from the experimental work and consider the larger context of imagination. So my research is in an area called philosophy of science, which is relatively unknown, even though it touches all corners of the scientific world. And what do I do? So first of all, I map the scientific field I'm interested in. For instance, we recently published a review, me and my advisor, that contained over 100 papers of experimental behavioral studies in animals, like the one I showed you with the chimpanzee. And we wanted to know what kind of tasks are being used, what is the relationship between these tasks and imagination, and what animals are being included in the studies. Now, this enables me to bring together different fields. I was talking before about how I'm looking both at behavior and at the brain. Now, unfortunately, these fields don't really communicate with each other. So a scientist in one field doesn't necessarily know what's going on in another field. And it's my job to bridge and build these connections. Now, this also allows me to identify overarching patterns. For instance, since I'm interested in evolution, I'm looking from fish, which shared a common ancestor with us 500 million years ago, up until humans, whereas experimental scientists are limited to a much smaller group of animals. This also allows me to point out research gaps. So in this review we saw that some animal groups that are very important in terms of our evolution are not even being studied. So we can advocate to include them in future research. And finally, I aim to construct more robust theories based on a larger and diverse pool of evidence. And if I sold my research program well, you think all of this is super obvious. But surprisingly, it's not really being done, especially not in terms of imagination. Okay, so why does this work belong in a philosophy department? Well, when we start to ask the big questions, for instance, about imagination, we quickly realize that these are philosophical in nature. So for instance, I'm asking, what is imagination? How should we define it? How central is imagination to the human experience? And can we ever really know what another person or another animal is imagining? And philosophers have been asking these questions for millennia. Additionally, I think such research has big implications. For instance, I think the most obvious one is animal treatment. So if animals can imagine, maybe they miss their family members when we separate them. So we might want to minimize that and more generally consider what kind of environments we supply the animals in our care. If we think how central imagination is to the human experience, then maybe it has important roles in mental health and illness. So for example, if someone has a challenge imagining a better future for themselves, this might play an important role in their depression. Finally, when we think what imagination even is, we can ask, is it a skill? How can we develop it in children, and is this an important goal? So I want to end by just saying one word about the relationship between philosophy and science. Now, obviously, empirical scientific research is hugely important, and none of the work I presented today would be possible without it. However, I also think that scientists can benefit from considering their research in a larger context. And there is a good chance that somewhere in the world right now, there is a philosopher of science that is doing work in your research area. So I would like to imagine a future in which philosophers and scientists come closer together and benefit from each other's perspectives. And I want to ask you, can you imagine such a future? Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so thank you for listening, and I am waiting to hear your questions if you have any. Gal.
Thank you so much.
You're getting a microphone.
So thank you so much. It's amazing work, and I imagine such a future too from the scientific side, and I think it's also related to being in Azrieli, so that's wonderful. So I love it, and I love your research direction, and I wanted to ask, maybe it's a bit skewed because of the example that you gave with the chimpanzee, but why do you insist on calling it imagination versus something like mental simulation or planning or something like that that would at least convey less of a subjective character, and maybe people would find it easier to think that animals have it, and you do have, I guess, more grounding to study those relatively objective terms?
Yes, that's a great question. And it really, I think it kind of connects to what I know that you're doing. I'll say it like this. People studying animals don't want to talk about the subjective side at all. They talk about memory, they talk about planning, like that's what they do, and that's great. I think I have I think it's a certain privilege because I'm in the philosophy department to talk about the subjective side, but in the end, I think that we humans have this subjective feeling of imagination, and it's really central to who we are as humans. Like, think about it this way. We spend most of our waking hours either in the past or kind of planning the future, and it's actually quite hard to stay present. So I want to know, how did this state of things come to be? And I think we need to ask about this in animals. Now, maybe they don't have imagination. Maybe they can plan magically without imagination. I don't know, but I think it's an interesting question to ask.
Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much. It's very interesting. I
Thank
have
you.
two questions, more about your field in general. And your research is very interesting. I'm interested in first, how do you deal with what I imagine is a very wide range of literature, and how you're choosing to deal with that in your work, and also about the development of the philosophy of science. When do we see this sort of field emerging? And if you can speak a little bit more about that.
All right, great, yeah. Maybe I'll start with the second one. So I think historically, from my very limited understanding of history, like philosophy and science were kind of the same thing for many centuries, and then slowly they kind of came apart. But I think from the beginning there were always philosophical aspects to science. And like whenever we do science, we have some assumptions, and I was like, my MA is in neuroscience, so I was kind of a scientist before, and I did some experiments, and there were assumptions that I was either unaware of them or like didn't deal with them because it wasn't the issue, I guess. But I think that the idea is science is not only like political and cultural, and all this is true, but it also, there are philosophical questions that science is trying to get at. So I think it's interesting to think about them, like for me. And then in terms of the literature, of course, it's huge. I come from neuroscience, so I just like stepped over to philosophy of neuroscience. I don't know philosophy of science more generally, like I know a bit about it. And I mostly read neuroscience right now, but it's in my research plan of the PhD I submitted to the university that I will do philosophical work. So in 2 or 3 years, I will come back and talk about that. Yeah, I don't, okay.
Thank you, it was really interesting. So I'm curious about your point of view. So what do you think? Can animals imagine, and to what extent?
Yes, good question. So in the beginning, I kept changing my mind about it. I think that planning requires some form of imagination. So if this chimpanzee, because he's given some tools and he can't immediately try them out, he needs to, in his head, know which tool is correct, and then at a later point, if he chose the wrong tool, he won't get grapes. This is for me? Okay, I don't know. So anyway, I think planning is like, this requires imagination. It has only been shown in great apes. So like chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, only our most closest species, let's say. So, and then in other animals, it hasn't been shown. It's a question, have we just not been able to show it? Like, are we just not good enough scientists yet? Or maybe they don't have it. And I think definitely a lot of animals, like, you know, the small worms, they don't have it. So there's this continuum. Yeah, that's my opinion. Last question. Who is it going to be? Am I choosing? You're choosing?
Great, really interesting. As someone that would also hope for this crosstalk and communication between philosophy and science, what are barriers? Why isn't this happening, and how would you envision it?
Between philosophy and science.
What are the barriers for the communication between philosophy and science, and how would you imagine such a dialogue?
Yeah, perfect last question. I think, honestly, because I come from science and I know that it's such a demanding career, I think that most scientists, they don't learn it, like, it's not in the BA programs, you know, and then they just don't have time for it, most of them, and I totally understand it. But you know, I was doing research in my MA, and like, I just did an experiment, and then I started reading about philosophy of science, and I realized that like, I was working on so many assumptions that no one checked, and I didn't check, and I was like, I have to stop right now and like think about this more. But I think most scientists, like, they're doing great research and a lot of it is working, and they don't have time, you know, to think about philosophical questions. So I totally get that. And it also kind of depends, you know, like if you're doing research in neuroscience and then you're going into like consciousness, so already you're in a more philosophical arena. But if you're just like trying to do something very practical, like cure cancer, then maybe it doesn't like pull you in that direction. And I think in terms of philosophers, I will just say that most philosophers don't have a strong scientific background. It's very hard, you know, to start reading scientific papers if you don't have a good background in this. And like philosophers, they're just interested in totally different things, most of them. So yeah, I don't know. I hope it will come together as time goes on. Thank you.